Hello, and welcome back to another video about the Song of the Fae. Song of the Fae is a game in development by 2PM Studios, which is made up of me, Ben, and Ricky. If you haven't seen one of these videos before or don't know anything about the game, I've got a quick little clip of it in action here. It is a deck-building roguelite with tactics gameplay. So it's heavily inspired by chess. Each piece you see here on this board is a unit you control in your army, and each of them have different mechanics, different movement patterns, different statistics that dictate how you will play. The goal is to defeat all the enemies in each room and carry your units forward from encounter to encounter. In this video, I'm going to be doing things a little bit differently. In the past few videos, I wouldn't say I've written the whole thing, but we've kind of made a presentation with loads of slides, and I've kind of had an outline on what I wanted to say ready to go. I want to try and do this one a little bit more casually, a little bit more off the cuff, and I'm going to be talking about some more emotional/personal elements of game development anyway, so it doesn't make as much sense to me to plan it all out. As you can see on the slide, I'm going to be talking about iteration and motivation, and this is probably obvious to anybody who works in a design field or has made anything, I suppose, but especially in game development, it's very emotionally taxing, and you might think that the process of making a game is sort of, you have this great idea, you sort of flesh it out, write it down, specify everything, and then you just make it, and it's good, and it's done. This is obviously not the case in practice. Like, if anyone has tried to make a game, you'll know you never get it right first go. You rarely get it right second, third, fourth, fifth go. And that can be really difficult to manage. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is a specific design problem in the game we've been iterating on. And that's the units. It's a pretty big part of the game. It is a tactics game, ostensibly. And your units are the pieces on the board that you control in each encounter. You have what's called an army in this game. So in a given room, the pieces that are on the board may not be all of the units you control. You actually have a sort of a surplus of units, and you pick a subset of them to bring into each encounter. And this is where the deck building element comes in. Your army lineup should be constantly evolving, changing as your deck would in a normal deck builder. And this is supposed to be a strategic element to the game, to selectively filter your army to the right composition of units to defeat the encounters you're being presented with. This is actually quite different to a lot of tactics games that people have made in the past. Typically, your Fire Emblems, your XCOMs, even like your Advance Wars, you want to protect your best units, you want to try and keep them, and ideally upgrade them, make your core army a bunch of units you know well and care about. And we actually want you to do the opposite of this. We want you to constantly be turning over the units in your army, building towards a particular composition that will ultimately defeat the boss of a given run you're on. Or at least that's the design we're talking about today. So the question we actually keep running into here is, how do you make players want to sacrifice their favorite units? And that's complicated because a lot of the solutions to this are really bad. We already have some kind of incentive for this in the game where units have stats. So if you look on the board here, I can't move my cursor, I'm sorry. Each of the units has a stat block above their head here, and you can see the full tooltip hovering over one of the units there as well. Seesh the Fuzzy is who I'm talking about. Those numbers correspond to attack and defense on either side of the slash, and different units, while they may have the same movement patterns, movement types, they have different numbers there that determine their strength. So you do have a sort of like, obviously I would prefer to pick a unit with higher numbers than one with lower numbers typically. And sometimes, is higher defense better, is higher attack better, depends on what kind of composition you have. We have some of the pieces there for this, but ultimately, if you get really good units with really big numbers, there's no reason to get rid of them in the current game. And that's a problem because that's exactly the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. So we've thought a lot about how you might encourage this, and we weren't happy with a lot of these ideas. These are some random ones I just threw up on here to show the fact that we've been thinking about this but hadn't decided on anything. What we really want is not a way that the game shouldn't sort of like, it shouldn't punish you for liking your units. It shouldn't be like, oh, you held on to this one for too long, I'm going to make it bad, or I'm going to make you destroy a unit right now. That's a heavy-handed solution to the problem. ideally we want the player to want to get rid of their good units, and that means creating these risk-reward scenarios, these trade-offs that actually make sense for you to get rid of things you like. This is sorry, I didn't realize what was coming next. This is the condensed version of talking about this. This is Ricky and I going back and forth, just being like, what are we going to do about this problem? It's not straightforward, and this is kind of what I wanted to dwell on in this video. In the middle of this process of trying to improve this system, we started to feel like there were no good answers, and that this game was bad, and that no one was going to play it, and our design goals were silly, and that it was just really frustrating to work on this. And this is something that you will always run into this in any design problem you're working on. There's like a pit of sorrow in the middle of the design problem, the design process, I suppose, and you first need to fall into the pit of sorrow and claw your way out the other side of it by refocusing. When this happens, it usually means you've lost sight of what you were trying to do in the first place. And that's sort of what's been happening to us lately. We got really hung up on the technical problems here with the game. Like, we've been messing with numbers a lot, thinking about, oh, how do you create the right incentives, the right technical elements? And this actually, at least for us, kind of kills our motivation sometimes, because we make video games mostly as a creative exercise, right? We think of things like, oh, that'd be cool, this is a really cool world, a cool mechanic, a cool feeling, and it's exciting to put it into the game. And when you get stuck like this, you can't really lean on that anymore. We're like, it's not cool to have to design a fiddly numerical solution to a numerical problem. So how do you bring that back? I can't really give you a magic answer to this. We just talked about it enough to the point where we finally came up with some things we liked, but it's got a lot to do with rock, paper, scissors. Rock, paper, scissors is a really simple game, obviously, and I'm sure that people have done plenty of, look at the deep game design behind rock, paper, scissors kinds of talks. I'm not going to really dwell on that. I'm just going to talk about the fact that this is a great game to think about in terms of creating trade-offs in your game, because there's no objectively best picks in rock, paper, scissors. It's a psychological game against your opponent, and that's also true of chess, which is one of our main inspirations for the Song of the Fae. It's not so much about what the objectively correct choice is, because it can be impossible to have enough information to determine that. Like, yes, if you could read your opponent's mind, certainly there's a best pick in rock, paper, scissors. If you could read your opponent's mind in chess, there is an objectively best move, but that's not how it works. And while you'll be playing against the computer in the Song of the Fae, against an AI, so it's not really a psychological game, we want to have that same kind of, it's not a certainty that you've made the right decision. You should be questioning it somewhat. So we went through a lot of different iterations on solutions for this, and all of these things you see in front of you are various things that went into the game or mocked up in Figma. We talked about it, we didn't like any of them, and they ultimately led to this. Each unit here has a little icon next to the stats now, and you can see the tooltip has some more information in it. I'm going to walk through all of this now. Each unit has an element associated with it, or if you think in like Pokemon terms, this is like the type of the Pokemon. And if you look at the little diagram underneath the tooltip, the yellow axis there shows weaknesses. So in the example here, metal is the ingot in the middle, and metal is weak to fire, and metal is strong against wood, which is the leaf. And conversely, there's that blue set of arrows going the other way. That's earth will reinforce metal, and metal will reinforce water. And what this means is the yellow line is relevant when you're attacking enemies. You will do more damage to enemies who are weak to your element, and they will do more damage to you if you're weak to their element. And the blue line is to do with your allies. If you put two units next to each other who have complementary elements, so for example here, the dog, Belm, the infant who I'm hovering over, is metal, and the two units on the left side here that are blue are both earth. And if I were to put an earth unit next to Beln, it would increase Beln's attack and defense, but it would also decrease the earth unit's attack and defense. And we think this creates some really interesting incentives, because now you have You have incentives based on what enemy elements you'll be facing, which is something that will be not entirely random in the game. It's going to be sort of a controlled thing, what elements you run up against. And you also want to pick allies who synergize with one another in a way that's actually going to be beneficial for you. So there's, combined with existing like buff and debuff systems in the game, this is actually quite deep, and you really have to give yourself a moment to consider the consequences of your moves. But more than that, this is really good for creating turnover in the army, because you might have a really, really good swordsman with a high attack, high defense, but if they have an element that is useless against the enemies you're facing, or doesn't synergize well with the other units in your army, you have a good reason to get rid of them. And so this is a piece of the puzzle. We need to give you moments in the game where it makes sense to actually sacrifice a unit. What I mean by that is, like, perhaps you can trade one unit for another, sacrifice a unit for money, and then use that to buy a new unit, sacrifice a unit for equipment that might be equipped to a unit in the future. That's all a little bit open-ended still, but this gives you a much more complicated optimization problem, and it's complicated enough of a problem that you can't just say what the right thing to do is. You have to almost go with your gut, and this might be controversial too now I think about it, but we kind of want you to play this game with your gut the majority of the time, and then when it really counts, in those really tricky encounters, that's when you get really calculating and cognitive about it. Because I think it weighs on the player too much to have to agonize over every single move in a game. And if you think about, well, at least the way that I like to play chess, which is not well, to be clear, just I like to play it, I like to move instinctively for the most part. You want to have an answer ready to go if anything that the player does, right? And you just immediately make the move. And that's what we're going for in this game, where it should almost be like, as soon as the enemy finishes moving, you know, oh yeah, this is what I want to do. I need to capitalize on this, set up for this. You know, it's an instinctive reaction. And I think that's kind of the core design of the Song of the Fae, to be honest, is steering into that, making it an instinctive gut reaction that you can later justify with calculations if you want, but there's no specific way that is the exact right way to play the game. So this is a shorter video, I think, than the others that I've done. I haven't actually checked the recording time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about motivation at the end here. And I touched on this in the middle, that you need to reconnect with why you're doing something to keep you interested in it. And a lot of our trouble here was trying to come up with mechanical solutions to mechanical problems, instead of realizing that mechanics are not separate to narrative, to art, to game feel, to design, to any of it. This is all actually deeply interrelated. It's like there's a holistic approach to making video games, which is what we're going for. And what I really mean by that is, you can't design in a vacuum. You can't say, we need to fix these mechanics, these rules are broken, we need to make the rules better, because it's often about how the rules feel just as much as how the rules technically work. The element system is something we're happy with because it inspires a level of, I don't know, it fits with the imagination element where we want in the game, where we talk about the game as if, like, literally in the Song of the Fae, the bard has been pulled into this world controlled by these mystical creatures, the Fae, and is in this mortal life or death tournament playing a game called WizardChess, which is meant to be this, like, crazy chess-like game with a whole bunch of magic. It was developed by wizards who had nothing better to do, and except for, you know, get really good at this contrived game. It's sort of like, we think about holo chess in Star Wars when they're playing on the Millennium Falcon, like how it makes no sense when you look at the board what they're doing. We want this game to kind of be like, what on earth is going on? But there is ultimately a pattern and a strategy beneath it. And elements sort of feed into that in a really nice way, where you're like, oh, these pieces are magically imbued with the elements of the world. Like, you don't need a really concrete explanation for that. That's part of the mystery and the narrative of the game we're making. And it actually ties into the Fae in the game really nicely, because we sort of have this idea. It's a little bit like Greek pantheon inspired, I suppose, where each of the Fae each have an alignment to a certain element in our minds, and that's what's going to dictate the kind of enemies you face on the way to battling these Fae in the game of WizardChess. It's also very funny to me that it can be extremely like this extremely serious life or death battle playing a board game that is like this contrived and magical. And this stuff I'm talking about now isn't really in the screenshots. It's not really in the tweets. It's not really in the presentations I've given so far. It's only in our heads, and we're slowly trying to realize that through the game. But the thing that I have been thinking about recently is that this stuff is the core of why we make games. The thinking about these crazy like narrative ideas and the silly dialogue moments and like comedic interactions we might be able to put in. And fixating on the mechanics pulls us away from that source of motivation. So this isn't really a like you should do this tip for how to make video games. This is talking about when I find that I'm fixating on a design problem and getting too mechanical, I'm too zoomed in. Sometimes you just need to step back and remember like it's supposed to be fun to create games. We're creating a world to invite the player into for them to understand I suppose this is probably very specific to Ricky and I, what I'm talking about here. Our friendship has consisted for many, many years of creating like a shared imagination, a shared imaginary world, and inviting people into that. And every time we find ourselves stepping away from that perspective, we start to lose focus on what the point of doing this is. And this was made really obvious to me when we sort of pushed ourselves to get out the most recent demo and maybe not as many people played it as we would have liked. That's not really the point. It's that when we pushed ourselves to do these mechanical things, going down a checklist, fixing bugs, being like, oh, do our due diligence here, we lost our connection a little bit to that source of motivation. And it's really easy to do this. Like, it happened to me maybe 3 or 4 times this year where I've had to remember, oh, right, it's meant to be fun to make video games. Let's go back to that. So yeah, that's really what I wanted to talk about. Like, remember why you're doing it. It's not to solve hard design problems for me. Like, I like that. That is part of what motivates me and I find enjoyable about the work. But the reason I'm doing this is to be creative, to make something, to imagine. Sorry about the dog noises in the background there. That's what you get living in the suburbs. So that's pretty much it. Yeah, this has been a really different presentation, and I hope that you guys like it. It's not so technical, but I'm trying to be a bit more open about the actual emotional process that goes into developing this game, and into our thoughts and how they translate into design decisions ultimately. So let me know what you think. Please like the video, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. I love everyone who replies to me on Twitter, who replies to me on these videos, who watches them. It means a lot that you're all following along. And if you're interested in the game, please check it out on Steam or itch and wishlist it if you're interested, or just follow me on Twitter if you want to hear more thoughts like these, see behind the scenes game development stuff, be notified about future videos. So, thanks. Have a lovely day.